say hello to you all again. My name is James Fahn. I'm the Executive Director of Internews Earth Journalism Network. We are a global community of over 14,000 journalists from all over the world, over 180 countries. And we're actually, quite similar to the Global Investigative Journalism Network. We're kind of have a similar model. EJN, as we're known, we've been around since 2004. Our mission is to improve the quantity and quality of environmental and climate coverage. So if you're interested in covering climate change or the environment, doing investigative reports, and we all know there's a big need, strong demand to investigate climate-related stories. Do check us out. We have a website at www.earthjournalism.net. It's free to join, and we definitely welcome all professional journalists to come and learn and find out about opportunities to improve coverage of the environment and climate change. So this is a rather special session because we are coming to you live from the COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow, Scotland. This has been a long-awaited summit. It was delayed from a year ago. It was supposed to be held in 2020, but was delayed because of the pandemic. And it's really the most important climate summit we've had since the Paris summit in 2015 that led to a landmark climate agreement. This Glasgow summit is supposed to increase the ambitions. Countries are supposed to come here with stronger targets to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases that are causing our planet, our atmosphere to warm drastically and cause all kinds of impacts and problems. So it has been a busy week here at the COP. You're going to hear more about it from our excellent panelists. We're very fortunate to have a wonderful team of veteran journalists from all over the world joining you today. I will quickly introduce them. We have Fermin Coupe from Dialogo Chino. He's based in Argentina, but again, like all our panelists, we're all coming to you live from COP26 Climate Summit. We have Joydeep Gupta, a director of the South Asia director of the Third Pole website focused on the Himalayan region and downstream countries. We have Imelda Abano, the founding president of the Philippine Network of Environmental Journalists. And we have Mildred Mulenga from Pana Press, a senior correspondent there. And they're all veteran climate journalists. They know a lot about how to cover this issue. We're going, this session might be a little less formal than some of the other sessions. We haven't prepared kind of formal presentations for you. We want to give you, first of all, we're going to go around the panel and give you a sense of what's been happening at the COP, our first hot takes of the summit, if you like. And then we'll give each panelist another chance to talk about what they think is needed in terms of investigating climate change, doing more investigative reporting of climate change issues. And I will simply say that since this is such a huge topic, really covering just about everything, there is a lot of scope for investigative reporting. But we're going to get into all that. Let me start first by asking, again, the panelists to quickly tell us what has been what their take is on what's happened so far at the summit and what they're hoping to do here, because there is another week of negotiations. It's going to be quite tense negotiations. There's a lot going on. So let me turn it over first to Joydeep Gupta as our most senior journalist. Joydeep, I hope that's a compliment. Please take it away, Joydeep, and tell us your thoughts.
Okay, I've unmuted myself. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, thanks. So, yeah, the COP has actually started and has gone on for the first week better than the prognosis had suggested. And that's quite interesting because the prognosis was very, very bleak. And the thought was that due to lack of new pledges by so many big polluters, due to lack of finance commitments by the rich nations, there would be very little progress. We still have a problem. Those very thorny issues of finance haven't been sorted out, not by any means. But as things stand right now, the updated pledges are perhaps as ambitious as we could have expected, given the the global situation. But of course, they're not good enough to keep global warming down to controllable levels. We know that even the current pledges will take us to a 2.7 degree warmer world compared to pre-industrial times by the end of the century. So we definitely need to do more, much more. And these negotiations have always been about how to do this, but these negotiations have always been bedeviled by various very short-term interests, which are essentially reflected by various national governments. And that's a problem. Given that these negotiations are, I suspect, 3 steps forward, 2.5 steps back, and we seem to have taken at least 1.5 of those steps in the first week, which gives us a scope for cautious optimism on what's going on.
Thank you, Joydeep. That's yeah, that's a bit of a surprise, but let's turn it over now to Imelda Abanyo from the Philippines. What are your initial thoughts about the summit, please?
I'll quickly remove my mask. Thanks, James. So over the last few days, world leaders, young activists, and climate advocates from around the world have raised their voices. And actually, as we talk now, there is a big rally going on, and they wanted the countries to commit to action on climate change. And one of the contentious issues is the end of coal. So, for instance, there are a lot of promises, pledges made. Ones that more than 40 countries have committed to shift away from coal in pledges made at the COP climate summit. So, and another thing is that major coal-using countries, including Poland, Vietnam, and Chile, are among those to make some commitments. But the sad thing is that some of the world's biggest coal-dependent countries, including China and the US, did not sign up on this. They have signed up to, for instance, the US, they have pledged to end public financing instead for unabated fossil fuel projects abroad by the end of 2022. So I think for the developing countries, like for instance the Philippines and those in Asia or Africa, this is one of the contentious issues: the end of coal, the oil, and of course the natural gas, and that is what we are trying to watch out here at COP26.
Thank you, Imelda. And now we're going to turn it over to Fermin to talk about his perspective. He's originally from Argentina. Fermin, take it away, please.
Thanks, James. Sorry, I had to take my mask for some. Okay, so thanks everyone for being here. Thanks, James, and everyone for the introduction. So following up with what Joydeep and Imelda was saying, this is my 6th COP so far, and based on what we have been seeing, definitely I see room for optimism. I think we've seen a fair number of announcements so far in the week, covering coal, fossil fuels, deforestation, you name it. I mean, there's been really full week, full first 3-4 days pack of announcements, then we gotta actually follow them and see if the governments deliver on them, and that's gonna be the challenge after COP. But I think that based on that, the expectations are high, the demands are high as well. As Imelda was saying, we have the march today, and there's gonna be another march tomorrow. Basically, the social and environmental activists here at the venue are demanding an actual action and an actual roadmap to deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I think there's going to be a growing pressure on the coming days to actually finalize the pending details of the Paris agreements, with the role of carbon markets playing a big role in the coming days. But now we are entering into the more technical side of things on the second week. So basically the big guys, the politicians are all gone now here at the venue, and we are going to see discussions going into detail, into the fine print, and trying to see how that plays out.
Thank you, Fermin. And what Fermin has said is so true, that even once governments have made commitments, we need to make sure that they actually live up to them. And that, of course, is a very important role for all of us investigative journalists, is to hold governments to account. Now I'll turn it over to Mildred to talk about her perspective on the first week of the conference. Mildred?
Thank you very much, James. For Africa here, one of the main issues, it's of course finance. They want to see, the African negotiating group want to see that there is a commitment to financing, different projects in adaptation and mitigation in Africa, because they are saying that the continent only contributes just 4% of global total greenhouse gases, the GHG emissions. So we are the lowest of any region, and yet they are saying that, the continent's socio-economic development is threatened by the climate crisis. So in other ways, Africa contributes less emissions, but suffers the bunch of the, different consequences. So what they really want to come out from here, it's just the commitment from developed countries, just to up that game, to see that finance that's pouring in. Thank you.
Thank you, Mildred. So yeah, that is kind of our hot takes of the first week of the climate summit. And we are happy to answer any questions you may have about covering the summit. It's a very interesting experience. If you've never had a chance to go to a climate summit, to cover it as a journalist, I strongly recommend you do so. It's besides finding lots of wonderful stories and covering a very important topic, it's like an immersion course. You learn anything and everything about climate change. I'm also happy to say that usually EJN, most years, we offer fellowships for journalists to travel to the climate summits and cover them for your home media outlets. But now we're going to go back to the panelists and broaden the picture a little. We're going to pan out a little and talk about, well, besides just the summit, what other climate-related issues need to be investigated? This is, again, a huge issue. And obviously, the use of fossil fuels and the fossil fuel industry is at the heart of the issue. So there's certainly plenty to investigate there, but it goes well beyond that to many other topics: agriculture, industry, transportation. And we're going to hear more now from the panelists about what are the other topics that you at home can and should be looking into, because there's just so much to look into, to investigate. So let me turn it back to Joydeep, and he can talk a little bit about some of the investigative work he has done and he thinks needs to be done. Joydeep?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, okay. So, all investigative work doesn't need to be very dramatic. There are stories that can be done with a simple bit of investigation, but that has dramatic impacts. A simple example would be to look at, let us say, corn production or say wheat production over years and compare that with the rising temperature in that area. So there is scope for doing a lot of this kind of stuff, but there is definite scope for doing more serious and long-term investigative stuff, in the sense of going one by one to look at who is funding, for example, coal mining or coal production in a given area. So fossil fuel funding is a major area of investigation that needs to be looked at. Another major area of investigation that needs to be looked at is we now have an enormous number of projects going on in many parts of the world, not just the developing world, also the developed countries, for people to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So how are these adaptation projects doing actually on the ground? Because very often, far more often than should happen, when we actually check the adaptation projects on the ground, we find enormous problems associated with corruption. We find enormous problems associated with the money not reaching the affected communities. So offhand, immediately in terms of climate-related investigative stories, these are two large themes that I can think of. One is look at fossil fuel funding. Who's funding fossil fuels? We are hearing from all the global banks that they will not fund a coal mine. They'll not find a coal-fired power plant. So who's funding? How are they still going up? Look at that. And the other is there is a lot of money coming into adaptation. Is that working? Is that being taken away through corruption?
Thank you, Jyoti. Yes, as we've learned in the US, I believe we've seen that as other investors have backed out of funding coal, a lot of private equity firms have taken over supporting them. Thank you for your questions. Those in the audience, please keep them coming. We are going to answer them. We just want to give the panelists one more chance to speak, and then we will get to your questions. So please keep them coming, whether it's about the climate summit or climate change coverage in general. But I'm going to turn it again over to Imelda to talk a little bit about her experience with investigative reporting and what she thinks needs to be done. Imelda?
Yeah, thanks, James. I think here at COP26, we're also looking at the non-negotiating blocks, or what we call the climate vulnerable countries from Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, Middle East, and the Pacific. So as a counterpart of those pledges or beautiful pledges from developed countries, they have also proposed this what they call climate emergency PAC. So where they have reiterated the disbursement of the or delivery of the 100 billion climate finance, and of course urges the high emitting countries to keep the 1.5 climate change goals. They are saying that climate finance is really important, and the pledges that they have made is a good step forward, ending coal. But then again, we have to go back to what's our goal in this climate summit. So that's what they are looking at, and as a journalist, that's what we are also following up, coming from the poorer or vulnerable nation.
Thank you, Imelda. And I know you've been involved in um, in leading some investigations on who's financing fossil fuels in Southeast Asia. And now I'll go back to Fermin, please talk about his perspective from South America.
There we go. Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, James. As part of the work that we do in Diálogo Chino, we track down investments mainly from China across the region. So that means looking at fossil fuels, looking at renewable energy projects, looking at subsidies on fossil fuels, which are quite significant across the region, hydropowers, so there's a lot of dams across the region with a lot of impacts, and agriculture, as you guys know, it's one of the main economic drivers across the region, and in many cases it's associated with high use of pesticides and agrochemicals, and in many cases leading to impacts across the region. So we try to track down those investments and research on them and look at the impacts that they are doing. And in many cases it's tricky because actually going and speaking with the Chinese company involved in the project is usually very difficult. But we want to give a voice to the people on the ground that are affected by those projects, but while simultaneously looking into the data and looking and doing a proper research on those projects. So, for example, we reported in one of the biggest projects by China in Latin America, which is the dams that are being done in southern Argentina and Patagonia. We've looked at the impacts of renewable projects that were supposed to be good, but actually weren't that good for local communities in the site. So we try to do a follow-up with data journalism and at the same time try to do on-the-ground reporting as much as possible.
Thank you, Fermin. And now to Mildred and her perspective from Africa on what needs to be investigated when it comes to climate change. Mildred?
Sorry, thank you very much, James. One of the things that needs to be investigated, if you look at reporting climate change, particularly in Zambia, where I come from, it has to do with agriculture because, you know, there are a lot of issues that needs to be covered because Zambia is classified into 3 ecological regions, which is Region 1, Region 2, and Region 3. But this is in terms of the rainfall, which is received on average. So you find that because of the agriculture and livestock production, they are largely dependent on rainfall, and the country's high rainfall availability and limited irrigation capacity makes it very vulnerable to climate change. So what has been happening is that programs are being, you know, introduced to try and educate the local people, especially small-scale farmers in local community who wants to keep on growing these crops which are not climate resilient. So some programs have been brought in for intervention so that at least they can try to ask them, depending on the ecological region they fall in, so that they can at least try to grow crops which, you know, which are drought tolerant if they are coming from a region where there is drought. But you find that there is still that persistent. It's very difficult to change the mindset of most of these farmers. They still want to go ahead and plant, for instance, the stable maize, because this is where government is pouring a lot of money. This is where there is a market available. So they still want to plant that despite you know, not receiving so much rainfall, but programs and interventions are being put in place and also offering alternative livelihoods. In some cases, you find that interventions have been done where they are offering alternative livelihoods like goat rearing, so that they can be goat rearing when one family gets a goat, and then when they become 10, after they have, they become 10, and then they pass on to the other community, just to try and divert them to start even doing a deforestation, which is, you know, which has affected the country a lot because of a lot of charcoal burning. Yeah, so there are so many programs now, at least, which have come into place to try and just to intervene and put measures to try and address these situations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mildred. Yeah, so some of you may not be aware, but agriculture, livestock, logging, these have huge impacts on climate change. They are responsible for somewhere between 20 to 25% of all the global emissions that cause global warming. But these topics receive far less attention when it comes to climate change than, say, fossil fuels. So there's a lot of scope out there for digging into these issues. We're gonna turn it over to you in the audience now for your questions. We've got the first question coming in. And this, I'd like to ask our panelists to kind of volunteer as to who wants to answer that. I think all of you could probably speak to this, but could you refer to the difficulties that delegates and civil society are experiencing in accessing the negotiations at the COP? What have been the challenges to ensure participation? Anyone like to take a crack at that? Raise your hand. I can, yeah, Joydeep.
Yeah, I was just saying that any of us could answer that. Absolutely. So yeah, this is the point is that it is a COVID affected COP, so there is not very much that we can complain about in terms of COVID restrictions, COVID forced restrictions. But yes, if you are going to allow thousands of delegates from various governments into plenaries sessions and let them crowd one another, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't allow more than the handful of observers and media that you allow into the plenaries. NGOs are not being allowed into the media center. So there are lots of barriers being put which do sound completely A, unnecessary, and B, discriminatory. And yeah, that's not a good thing to happen at all.
Anybody else want to comment on this? Hermine?
Yeah, sorry, with the face mask takes a little bit of time. So yeah, I definitely agree with what Joydeep was saying. I think this summit is particularly unique compared to the ones that we have all experienced in the past. There was, at least on a more personal note, I think it was highly necessary to host the conference despite the limitations of COVID. I mean, the sort of negotiations that the delegates carry out online are not the same that the one they do face to face. The hallways, gatherings and meetings, those sort of things that they can just do it online. So that's kind of the reasoning behind why to host the summit now. Having said that, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of difficulties from civil society and NGOs overall to get the proper access to the venue with restrictions in every room, more or less. So whenever you go to attend a meeting or attend the side event at COP or even the plenaries in the negotiations, there's a quota of people that can enter per room, which on one aspect makes sense because we are still in the middle of the pandemic, with the UK having 50,000 cases per day. But at the same time, we wanna encourage transparency. We wanna have civil society having a proper access into the meeting, because their role is fundamental as part of the negotiations. So it's part of having a balance. Still, the role of the UK presidency as part of COP26 has been highly questioned. We have to acknowledge that as well. They basically have had 2 years to prepare the summit, and over the first couple of days, it has seemed fairly disorganized with long queues and difficult issues in terms of logistics. But yeah, basically rounding up, I mean, it's a summit hosted in the middle of the pandemic, so it's expected to see these kind of things.
Thank you, Fermin. Imelda, Mildred, have any comments you want to add? Okay, well, I will say that you can see this banner behind me, the Climate Media Partnership each year does bring journalists from the Global South to the climate summits in an effort to try and improve access, at least to journalists from low and middle income countries, because it is an issue every year for delegates and NGOs and media to be able to, travel to and cover these summits where huge global decisions are being made, but particularly this year with COVID, it's become even more difficult. We've got another question. Do you have any advice for cross-border investigations on multilateral banks funding coal plants? Melda, I think I'm going to call you on you for this one, because you are in the thick of a bunch of investigations in Asia on this very topic. Do you want to speak to this, please?
Yeah, thanks, James. So actually at the Earth Journalism Network, we have this collaborative project. It's actually currently, it's going on. So we call it the Available But Not Needed. So it's a month-long effort of the Earth Journalism Network to facilitate collaborative journalism reporting project between 6 media outlets and more than a dozen of journalists in throughout Southeast Asia. So it's a cross-border reporting covering the challenges of going after who is funding coal, who is funding fossil fuels and the like, and how private and public bankers are still investing in the fossil fuel economy in Southeast Asia. So I think we have, if you go to our site, earthjournalism.net, you'll see our stories on fossil fuels there and who is funding which countries and who is funding more. So I think that kind of investigative cross-collaborative reporting must be continuously done, not just in Southeast Asia, but throughout the world or other parts of the world.
Thank you, Imelda. And yeah, that is a big issue. Is who is still, investing all this money in polluting fuels. And it's not just in Asia, it's in other countries too. Although there was big news that came out just before the summit, because China announced that it would no longer fund overseas development of coal-fired power plants. That's, I believe, after Japan and South Korea came out with similar policies. And so that is, China is really one of the last big state funders of coal-fired power plants around the world, particularly through its Belt Watch, its Belt and Road Initiative. So there's still private funders out there doing it, so it's still more investigative work to be done, but there has been movement there. Another question coming in. There's a $1.7 billion pledge to secure tenure rights for indigenous peoples and local communities who hold key solutions to climate change. What has been the response? Has this spurred more attention to the topic? Does anyone want to speak to the role of indigenous peoples? And of course, that they have come under a lot of pressure during the pandemic, especially in Latin America. I don't know, Fermina, at the risk of putting you on the spot, do you want to speak a little bit about what's been happening in South America regarding indigenous peoples and the pressures they've come under?
Definitely, James. So every year at COP, indigenous people take a leading role, and it's perfectly fine that they should, and they should. They hold a key responsibility, and they have a lot of power in terms of what they can do to reduce and tackle the climate crisis. Latin America specifically as a region is one of the actually most affected region in terms of violence against environmental defenders and indigenous leaders. The tracker that is done every year by Global Witness, the UK NGO, it basically shows that Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, many Central American and South American countries, we see that violence against environmental defenders, as they are called, is worsened during the pandemic, and they were highly affected by the virus. Many of them sadly were diseased and were exposed to the pandemic. And if there's one thing that we always see at COP is the fact that they hold a lot of potential in terms of what they can do in order to tackle the climate crisis, and the fact that we see some sort of acknowledgement to that, I think it's a good signal. Still, I wouldn't be that hopeful in terms of what actually happens after COP, because the situation seems to keep on worsening every year regarding them, at least in Latin America where I'm based. But I think it's an interesting topic to research in, and I would encourage everyone to keep an eye on that and look basically into propositive climate solution stories that could be done regarding the role of indigenous communities.
Thank you, Fermin. Yeah, and I see.
Sorry, James.
Yeah, go ahead, Mildred.
Maybe, just a quick intervention. Okay, in Zambia, what is happening is most of the projects which are being funded by the Green Climate Fund and Adaptation Fund, they have to be a component, whether those project developers, they must indicate if the indigenous people, they were included in their research. So they must make sure that the indigenous people are agreeable to the projects which are being done. So they will always ask you, were the local people involved? Did you ask them for them to approve the projects? That's what I just wanted to contribute.
Thank you, Mildred. Yeah. And I see someone's posted stories from, for instance, Gustavo Faleros about a series he helped to produce documenting how environmental leaders in Latin America have been threatened, killed, intimidated. And this is a big issue, and this needs also to be, and this is not just Latin America. We know it happens a lot in Asia. It happens all over. That environmentalists, especially activists, are they are the victims of a lot of violence, and the same is true for journalists. Actually, every year there are journalists who cover environmental issues that get attacked and killed. So we need as much attention to these issues as possible. And I just want to add, because I noticed in the question they mentioned the tenure issue. It's the reason indigenous peoples are so important is because studies have shown that indigenous lands tend to be managed more sustainably, certainly than other public lands, but even sometimes they're managed better than national parks or other conservation areas. So it's a very interesting issue, and definitely worth looking into the role of indigenous peoples. Does anyone have any advice for cross-border investigations? Okay, sorry, we already did that question. I wanted to ask the question of Joydeep because I know he and his team have led a couple of interesting climate investigations. One looked at renewable energy and what's happening in India, particularly in regards to biofuels, which are often touted as a green energy source. And the other has to do with the impacts of climate change and sometimes unexpected impacts, for instance, on health. Joydeep, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, okay. I'll answer that. Yeah, the first one was an interesting one, and that James talked about. I hadn't expected that to be so big, such a big racket. But essentially, we were working with a journalist based out of Mumbai in Western India, and she had a tip off that biodiesel, which gets a lot of subsidy because it's supposedly green fuel, was getting adulterated with used cooking oil, so, which would otherwise have to be thrown out. And therefore, if you were otherwise get subsidies for say 20 liters of biodiesel, now you could get subsidies for 80 liters of biodiesel, whereas 60 liters of those will not be biodiesel at all. So this was a major racket that she unearthed. And I believe, of course, you cannot say that if there is a straight line relationship between those stories coming out and the authorities taking action. But in terms of time scale, shortly after those stories came out, authorities in 2 states of India did crack down on biodiesel sales. So that, I think, was a very good series of investigative stories that were done in partnership with us. The other one is also very interesting. And this is something that stares us in the face all the time. And it is so common. And the stories are in some ways so easy to do that they don't get done. All you have to do is to check out any coastal community in the world. It need not be only in the tropics. It can be anywhere, including in England, because I checked out some similar studies have been done in England, including in Louisiana in the United States. What is happening is that because of sea level rise and consequent saltwater intrusion into the coastal areas, the water that people drink is starting to get increasingly saline. Now, your doctor will tell you what happens when you have too much salt. Your blood pressure goes up. That's why your doctor tells you not to have too much salt. But what happens to those who are otherwise not having too much salt, but ending up with too much salt in their bodies because the water they're drinking is turning increasingly saline? And this, to me, is a subject ripe for investigative stories, because one of the things that we found when we started checking out, at least in India and Bangladesh, we checked out and found that local doctors, whether in the private or the public sector, are not really keeping track of keeping any record. They all have memories of a rising number of blood pressure cases, but nobody has any record. So this is a record, is a story that is definitely worth investigating, to my mind, yes.
Thank you, Joydeep. I want to turn it over up now also to the panelists and ask them if there are any other particular topics related to climate change that they think are going underreported. I know I have some thoughts on this, but before I weigh in on that, anything that you think journalists out there need to be doing more of, particular topics? Okay. For me?
So just following up on one thing, as you guys that are watching probably have heard, one of the big things that there's growing attention on is climate funding and the money that is flowing from to developing countries mainly. So there was one big pledge that was done in Copenhagen, basically to have $100 billion per year by 2020 flowing into developing countries. Basically, the countries that are most affected by climate change are the poorest ones, and they can't cope with the effects of extreme weather events. And at the same time, they don't have the money to actually start reducing their emissions. So they need support from developed countries, but that means that there's a lot of money flowing around from country to country. Even if it's not enough, the money that is actually needed, we basically have to follow that money and see what's going on. Where's that money being invested? Even if they are all projects that they should be done. I mean, we need developing countries having the money and actually reducing their emissions and coping with climate adaptation. As reporters, we should be looking more closely at what's actually being done by national governments when they get that money, because that's key here. Because as years pass, the money should be and will probably increase. I mean, we have seen signals in that aspect at COP of developed countries actually committing to more money, and that basically puts a responsibility on us and on civil society to actually track governments and see if the money is going to where it should be going, and what are actually the projects that are being done on the ground with that money. I think there's definitely not that much stories being done regarding that.
Thank you, Fermin. We actually have a related question coming in from Argentina. Maybe you can respond to this as well, or anyone really. Isabel Guerrero asks, I understand that states have access to UN funds to combat climate change. Not just UN funds, but all kinds of bilateral funding. Is this information public? Sorry, did I say Argentina? This is from Venezuela.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. You're from Argentina, yes. Sorry. It's late on a Friday. But anyway, is this information public? Is it made public by aid agencies?
Yeah, definitely. So basically, there's several sources of climate funding. There's not just one. You have the multilateral development banks. You have the Green Climate Fund, which has been growing over the last few years. So they have a demand for transparency. Basically, they have to publish and any projects that they fund. If you guys go, for example, to the website of the Green Climate Fund, they publish there the projects that they fund and where is the money being located. So not every UN agency or every multilateral development bank has the same level of transparency as they should. So there's still some room of improvement in that regard, but there's definitely some interesting research work, basically desk-based work for those of you guys who are more interested on data journalism, to take a look at actually those spreadsheets and those projects and see what's being funded where. What can you do with that? Because that in most cases, that information is public. I mean, not in every case, but the level of transparency has been improving over the last few years.
Thank you, Fermin. I'm gonna weigh in a little bit on this topic as well, about because a lot of the aid funding is for adaptation now and for resilience, or increasing amount of it is. And it's going to be very important for all of us journalists to look very carefully at how this money is being spent, as Fermin said, but in particular on how we go about adapting to climate change, because there are many different ways to do it. And some of it is very wasteful and damaging. And some of it can be, can really help build resilience. And I'll give you some good examples. For instance, we have a big problem with sea level rise all over the world, and flooding in general. So how are we going to adapt to that? If you're a big construction firm, or maybe a politician that's looking to reward your supporters, you might vote to build a seawall, pour a lot of concrete, basically protect the coast with fortification. that seems like a kind of obvious thing to do. But as it turns out, these seawalls, they don't really solve the problem at all. They end up damaging the coastline. They cause a lot more erosion as the waves hit the walls. They rush back with force and they sweep away sand and beaches and shoreline. So a lot of experts now say we shouldn't necessarily rush to build this hard adaptation, as they call it. Hard in terms of concrete and cement, but look much more at what we call soft adaptation, because there are other ways, for instance, to protect the coast. And one of the most well-known and obvious ways is to, for instance, protect mangrove forests. We all know that mangrove forests these are trees that can thrive in salty water, and they protect the shoreline. So when the waves or storms hit the coast, it's time after time we see that those areas, those communities that have protected their mangroves are much better protected than the areas that have cut down their mangroves. And these mangrove forests are under threat all over the world. They're cut down for charcoal production, for shrimp farms and other aquaculture. But we need to maintain the mangrove forests, and not just for adaptation. It turns out mangrove forests are also one of the biggest carbon sinks. They store more carbon, which cause the carbon in the atmosphere is what causes climate change. Mangrove forests are a great way to store carbon and prevent it from being emitted to the atmosphere. But it's not just mangrove forests. There are all kinds of coastal ecosystems that do a great job of protecting the coast, including salt marshes, sand dunes, coral reefs, and so on. And there's a whole movement called the blue economy, which is trying to make coastal economy sustainable. And so to keep an eye out on how all these adaptation funds are being spent. Is it for hard resilience or soft resilience? What are the projects that are being touted? What are the projects that are being ignored? And I see, Joydeep, that we have a request that you share the link to the biofuel story. That
I did that on the chat line.
You did the saltwater story, but did you do the biofuel story also?
Oh, the biofuel story.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Yeah. Okay.
Another topic that I think journalists out there should keep an eye on is regards the green recovery, basically green recovery to the pandemic, because as the pandemic hopefully winds down soon, governments are investing a lot in their economies. They're passing stimulus packages, big aid packages to help rebuild economies that have been devastated under the pandemic. But how are they spending this money? Are they going to use it to support the fossil fuel industry? Well, it turns out, yes, actually, a lot of them are doing that. When actually it's a great opportunity to support renewable fuels, and support the transition to solar power, to wind power, to battery storage, to clean mobility, electric cars, and so on. I mean, a lot of governments are looking to boost their economies now, and we as journalists need to be monitoring how they're doing that. And so keep an eye out. I know our organization, the Earth Journalism Network, we're going to be offering webinars and story grants on green recovery. But beyond that as well, just look at what your own government is doing in terms of supporting your economy, because one of the biggest reasons that fossil fuels remain so strong is that governments subsidize fossil fuels with hundreds of billions of dollars of money. So instead of reducing our reliance on the fuels that cause climate change, we're actually spending taxpayer money to support these industries. Any other topics? Yes, Imelda, are you want to speak to this, please?
Yeah, if I may add, James, actually the real story is not in this conference. I would say that we should go back to the basic of highlighting the human face of climate change, which is going doing stories, hyper local stories. Like for example, in the Pacific region, we've written a lot of stories on relocation of communities, people affected by sea level rise, and in the Philippines or anywhere in Asia, flooding, disasters, in connection with climate change, and a lot more where we can highlight the stories of people actually. So I think it's one way for us to push policymakers to do more with regards to adaptation, mitigation, or any climate-related issues. So I think it's best for us to really go back to the basic and tell the stories of the people.
Thank you, Mel. That's a great point. And I believe you were involved in supporting a story in Fiji, right? Where as a result of that coverage of a village that was suffering from erosion and sea level rise, and that had been promised relocation funds for, I think, a decade, but nothing had been done for 10 years. And then as a result of a story by one of your colleagues in Fiji, the prime minister kind of tweeted about it, and so the government suddenly stepped in and helped the village to access relocation funds. So all of you out there working as journalists, your investigations, they have a real impact. They really do help people, and especially in the face of this monumental challenge of climate change, which I happen to believe will be the biggest story of this century. When we look back, 100 years from now, people are going to be looking at this and asking, what did you do to cover this issue or to address this issue? Because it's going to be affecting more people in more ways than perhaps any other issue. And then this issue of relocation and climate refugees is going to be one of the big stories. Joydeep, I know in India as well, as part of a project you led, one of your journalists, I believe he did a series of stories that led to a village being supported to relocate. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, okay. Yes, so, I was talking to people earlier about investigating stories of saltwater intrusion into local aquifers that essentially poison local aquifers, and people are forced to drink more and more brackish water. So another part of it is that people are forced to relocate away from the coast because their old homes, which in the case of many fishing communities in developing countries, the kind of shacks they used to traditionally live in were right on the beach, and those have been very badly affected due to sea level rise. And the result of that has definitely been that people have been forced to move back. Now, this particular story that James was referring to was of a village relocated like that, but there was no water source provided in the resettled village. They were being sort of forced to drink that same kind of brackish water till the story came out. And the impact of the story was that the government piped water to the village from a place 20 kilometers inland. So yes, what the stories you do have definitely have solid impact on the ground.
Thank you, Joydeep. I wondering, Mildred, if you have any other issues that come to mind, especially in Africa, that you think might be underreported at the moment or that you're seeing?
Thank you, James. I think one of the issues is just for journalists in their various countries just to take interest, like to find out if, for instance, their countries are not accessing, if they're having challenges accessing the money which is there for, mitigation and adaptation, for instance, on the Green Climate Fund adaptation. So it's better to investigate what are the challenges, or is it because our national countries, they don't have locally accredited entities to these two financial institutions? Or is it that, the developers themselves of these projects, they are not doing a good job, which to develop those concept notes into full proposals? And then just an interesting story I would want just to share with everybody. Like in our country right now in Zambia, there's a story which is going on concerning Forest 27. Forest 27, it's the reserved land where you're not supposed to build anything, just for environmental protection. So the previous government, which was voted out of power last August, they degazetted, the president himself went ahead and degazetted this forest land. And, the members of parliament, mostly ministers, they allocated themselves plots in that Forest 27, the degazetted land. They allocated themselves plots to build residential houses. And now these houses have been built, but nobody has yet shifted because they haven't reached the finishing level. So now the new government has come in, but now this is the story which journalists must come in, because one of the campaign promises by the new president was that as soon as he comes to power, he's going to degazette again this forest land. But now, since he has, but since now he has come back, nothing is being done. So I think it's one of the interesting issues which is going on in our countries, because it involves high-profile people who went ahead and built land on a forest reserve place. Thank you.
Thank you, Milton. Yeah, so looking at forestry issues of all sorts, we already talked a little bit about the role of indigenous people and how they play such a strong role in protecting often local forests and resources and landscapes. So we need to keep an eye on forests are such important carbon sinks, as well as being, habitat for biodiversity. We haven't even really talked about biodiversity that much. And I think we should maybe just spend a little time talking about it, because we have next year in 2022, we have a couple of summits coming up next year that you will want to keep an eye on. One is the biodiversity COP15. So just as there's a climate summit, there's also biodiversity summits around the Convention on Biological Diversity. Next year, the COP15 will take place in China. It's another big summit like this climate COP. It's supposed to be increasing ambition among governments. There's a move, for instance, to protect 30% of the planet, both the land and the sea, by the year 2030. And some governments have already signed on to that. I'm pretty sure the Biden administration has come out in support of that goal, even though the US is not signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So I do have a note that we need to wrap up soon. My understanding, Miranda, is that we're supposed to finish on the hour. So we have about 10 minutes left. If you have any more questions, I urge you to send them in now. I will say, in terms of climate change, we need to investigate not just the problem, the cause of climate change. Of course, the fossil fuel industry, plays a major role there. We need to look at what national not just private corporations, but national corporations. Most governments have a state industry that supports production of oil, gas, maybe coal too. And sometimes they don't get as much attention as the private sector. But we also need to investigate the solutions to climate change, because some of them, as I mentioned, we talked about adaptation. Some of the solutions may be not very well thought out. One of the big issues here at the summit is carbon trading, because there's an article, a section of the treaty that's being negotiated called Article 6. You might want to look that up if you're interested in trade issues. Article 6 would create and regulate a carbon market, global carbon market. This is a market where you can buy and sell carbon credits just like you would other products, and could be a really key solution to climate change, because it could help send money towards those countries and projects that are best able to prevent greenhouse gas emissions or to store carbon. But it could also be abused, and it could also let kind of wealthy polluters get off the hook by paying others to take these steps. And one of the big problems with markets, as we've seen everywhere, we know markets are very efficient at moving goods and services, and they're important role for that, but they can also be abused, and they can be cheated. There's cheating, and so I think a big role for journalists will be to make sure that if companies or governments are getting credit for storing carbon or preventing greenhouse gas emissions, that those credits are legitimate, that they're actually protecting forests, or they're preventing greenhouse gas emissions. And we've seen scandals where that those credits are not legitimate. Has anyone had any experience among our panelists or know of any stories related to investigating solutions to climate change?
Not carbon credit, James. I don't remember any such thing, but I do want to make this point that investigative stories should be done irrespective of what else is going on. The reason why I'm making this point is that if there is a problem with a renewable energy project, then we need to investigate that as well.
Yeah.
We are journalists, we are not activists. And just because renewable energy may be a better thing than coal and oil, that doesn't mean that a renewable energy project can't have problems, or that we shouldn't investigate those. I can immediately think of two stories. One of them was done in partnership with us, of a solar farm being set up and taking up a small part of a protected forest area, and under the guise of green energy. So there is a serious problem there that needs to be investigated. I mean, are we going to then say that we stop protecting our forests and we turn them into solar parks? Obviously, we're not going to say that. So if we see that happening, those are stories that we need to do. There is another whole series of stories that was done by many reporters in many outlets in India, that a lot of power lines carrying renewable energy from the solar parks and wind farms were coming through the habitat of a very endangered bird. And it was, I think, largely because of a lot of media coverage that went into it, that the Supreme Court of India has forced those entrepreneurs to take those power lines underground although the entrepreneurs really screamed, saying that that was going to increase the cost, where their projects would no longer be viable and they were doing green energy and all that. But then these investigative stories need to be done. Just because you are putting up a solar park or a wind farm doesn't mean you take your power lines to an area which has an endangered bird.
Thank you, Jody, for that reminder. Very important. We have to be looking through our investigative lens everywhere. So we now have just 4 minutes left. If you have any final questions, send it our way. If not, I'm going to turn it back to the panel. So I'll give you each 1 minute, please. Let me know your final thoughts on investigating climate change. Perhaps Fermin, I see you taking off your mask. Maybe you can take a shot to help us with that.
Yeah, thanks, James. So basically, I think that climate change specifically as a topic, it's still under research. When I say under research, I'm thinking of proper investigative journalism. And not just a 6-paragraph story. I'm thinking of a feature. I'm thinking of a story supported by data, by going to the ground, speaking to the people, looking at reports. I think that there's a lot of room to take advantage of that and actually exploit that as reporters. I think we should seize on that opportunity and seek support from our media outlets. I know it's tricky, and especially asking for editors for time or even money or whatever kind of resource. But organizations such as the Earth Journalism Network can help you guys with that. There's constant opportunities there. As James was saying, there's going to be one on the green recovery. There's stories on climate and biodiversity that you guys can look at the site. Even if it sounds difficult to get support from your actual media outlet, there's organizations like EGN willing to help you guys with that, and take it as an opportunity. I mean, it's while climate might seem in occasions, especially during COP, as a story that is being over-reported, but believe me that after COP, the peak goes down easily, and you guys will see most media outlets around the world, and I think it's fair to say that this is happening all over and all over the world. The coverage of climate stories goes down rapidly after COP. We need to actually keep it up quite significantly with solid reporting. And I know the demand is there. Now, based on I've done many courses on climate change in Latin America, and I know the reporters want to report on this. So I basically encouraging you guys to pursue it and go for it.
Okay, we got 1 minute left. Thank you, Fermin. Anyone want to say the final word? I want to thank all the panelists for a very productive discussion. I hope you in the audience have enjoyed it. We're hoping this will spur some ideas in you to improve your coverage of climate change. And all of us here on this panel, we welcome, your comments or questions, and we're happy to give any advice. We can help you to improve climate change coverage. We're just at the start. This is going to be a long and important struggle to deal with really the story of our time. So thanks to all of you who are working on all kinds of investigative reporting, whatever topic it is. It's really such important work, and we need you guys. So thank you for your hard work, and we hope to see you sometime at a climate summit or out in the field somewhere doing some investigative work on these issues. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.